Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cornerstone podcast. I'm your host, Claire Haneke, and today we will be joined by Margaret Rozga to talk about her upcoming book, Holding My Selves Together. And that book is going to be available super soon, if it's not out already. To check for pre orders or ordering the book, depending on when you're listening to this, go to our website, which is uwsp.edu/english/cornerstone/pages/books.aspx. And there you can pick up all of our titles and you can pre order or order Holding My Selves Together by Margaret Rozga. So, hi everyone, welcome to Cornerstone Podcast. Today we have the wonderful Margaret Rozga joining us to talk about her new book, Holding My Selves Together. Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Claire. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. So, today we're going to be talking about your new book that we're putting out with Cornerstone Press, Holding My Selves Together. It is a book of poems, some new and some that have been published at other places. Is that correct?
It is correct, yes.
Yeah, so let's just get started and talk about who you are. So, how long have you been writing for?
I actually can't remember a time when I didn't write. Even when I was in elementary school, I remember writing little notes and sticking them where I thought no one would find them. My sister found them. Uh, uh, but seriously, writing, trying to get published, trying to write poems that were publishable, probably about 30 years.
Wow. So, in that 30 years, uh what made you gravitate towards poetry over prose or a different type of writing?
I did try writing prose. I tried writing short stories. Well, I had been writing, of course, academic essays, as everyone does in school. And in graduate school, that intensified that prose writing. I always loved poetry. Uh, I had favorite poets, of course, and wished that I could do something like some of what I admired in poems I read. I did try writing fiction, wasn't really satisfied with what I was doing. I could write really short pieces, what are called flash now, but anything that got longer involved, well, okay, the characters have to go to work. Where do they work? And I didn't really have very much familiarity with a variety of jobs. And I really didn't want to write about people teaching English because there's lots of fiction that has those kinds of characters. And then I began to realize that the way I think is kind of natural to a poet. I think in terms of analogies, I think in terms of comparisons. And that's essential to what poems are and what poems do. I think of poetry as a kind of epistemology, a way of knowing that's different from the kind of analysis that we do in a lot of academic classes, where you take something and divide it up into parts. Poetry works in a different direction. It pulls things together. It sees how this is like that. So that just felt like something I could do. And so I started taking it seriously and doing more and more of it.
I love that comparison and contrast between academic writing and poetry because, like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Academic writing is all about picking things apart, and very rarely do we get the chance to really combine things, I think, especially in writing. So I love that idea of poetry. So, something that you mentioned to me before we started talking was the idea of multi voice poems. And the poem that people will be hearing today, Amplifying Hope, is a multi voice poem. We got to read it together, which was super awesome. And so, could you just tell us a little bit about that type of poetry?
And thank you for reading that poem with me. It's always a thrill to me to hear another voice join with me. Well, when I was first trying to write poems, I had small children, And so I wrote short poems, and I wrote about what I was experiencing, and those were kind of they were definitely single voice poems. Um, and as the children grew and as I got more practice as a poet and went to more readings and tried to write about some of my other experiences, I have been active in social justice issues for a long time. It struck me that sort of isolated voice was one thing, but a lot of my experience was with other people, with other voices, and I wondered if I could get that into my poetry. Let me just stop there for a minute and back up. There's also another element that enters here, and that is I'm not a very good listener. And when I would go to poetry readings, I needed something that would help me stay attuned to the poems. And when there was some interaction with the audience, that really helped me a lot. And different poets did it in different ways. And so I thought, I want to write the kinds of poems that when I read them in public, that other people who might have the same concern as I did, that is staying focused on what's going on, might appreciate a little variety. So there was that very practical factor there. But there was also an experiential factor. I remember going to see Entozaki Shanga's For Colored Girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, staged. She calls it a choreo poem. All the characters are interacting. There's a lot of monologues, but it pulls together, and the experience totally blew me away. Then at some time later, I had the experience of going to a poetry festival in Washington, D.C. It's called Split This Rock. It's held every other year. It is a poetry festival that concentrates on what they call poetry of witness and provocation, social justice poems. In addition to panels talking about poetry and poets reading, they have an event, some action in the Washington, D.C. area. And the first year that I went, that action was a cento, or cento, if you use the Italian pronunciation, performed in Lafayette Park across from the White House. And it was totally spontaneously composed. Everybody who was participating was supposed to read one line of whatever poem they wanted. And then it just went in succession, one reader after another, after another, after another. And that became the poem. And I think it was recorded, or the lines were, everybody gave a copy of their line to somebody who was going to put them together, so that there was a written version of this spontaneously composed poem. I'm not, if there is, I don't have it. But being in that event was so wonderful. The accidents, the random combination of lines sometimes really worked, really made sense. And the whole thing was um, just a wonderful experience of being with other poets. So a couple years later, there was action. There's a native burial mound, effigy mound in a park in Milwaukee, and two professors at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee were concerned about a proposed piece of legislation in Wisconsin that was going to allow excavation of Indian mounds. And they weren't particularly focused on the one in Milwaukee, Lake Park. There were some in a place that was undergoing some construction in Madison, and that was the impetus for the legislation, because they couldn't continue the construction because there were these Indian mounds. So the legislation said that the proposed legislation was that you would to continue to respect burial mounds, but mounds that were for some other purpose could be excavated. Well, how would you know until you excavate it whether it was a burial mound or not? So anyway, Margaret Newton and Kimberly Blazer, both poets and professors at UW-Milwaukee, and both Ojibwa, wanted to protest this action, and we're going to do it at this place in Lake Park in Milwaukee. And they had speeches and they had signage that was going to be there and other things, but how could everybody participate? That's what they were looking for. And I recalled this earlier event. I said, why don't we do a cento, everybody contributing to a line? Well, this time, instead of having it just be random spontaneous, somebody put out a call for lines, probably Margaret or Kim, and somebody arranged them so that we knew what we were going to do, and it spoke to the issue of respecting the earth and culture and the issue at hand. It turned out that the day of the action was the coldest day of the year. It was minus 20 degrees, not wind chill, minus 20 degrees. People wore their ice fishing boots. I went to a shoe store and I said, I want the warmest pair of boots you have. People were all wrapped up in scarves and mittens, and they would just unwrap to say their line and then wrap up again. But it was such a powerful experience for everybody involved, the readers, the people who sent lines, the people who just came to observe, the Overpass Light Brigade that held up signs. So I became convinced that when you join voices, you join energy, and that can be very powerful. So that's a long way of answering your question about how I came to the basic idea of a poet isn't necessarily just a solitary person writing and then reading all by him or herself. That poets are people in groups, people in communities, people interacting with each other, and poetry can show that. At least some poems can. Not every poem has to, of course. So then I began to look for other ways to do this. And the poem that we read this in this program, Amplifying Hope, began with a very small second part. There were maybe 2 lines, 2 very short phrases earlier, and the ending on with the same line, the 2 voices with the same line. And I did it that way a couple of times, and then I was going to do it again and ask somebody if she would read with me, and she looked at the poem and she thought about it and she said, I will if I can have more lines.
Was she an actor by chance?
I think she did some performance, yes.
I say that as a former theater kid myself, so.
Oh, okay, yeah. So we sat down and figured out, it was she picked some lines, and I suggested some lines, and we may have added some lines along the way. The evolution of the poem was that it went from one voice with a brief echo to a more compatible dual voice poem.
It's certainly a beautiful poem, and it was really fun to read, as I've said. I'm really interested in the connection between the multiple voices and social justice, which both of which seem really important to you and to your work. And I know there's a lot of talk just in the general conversation about hearing multiple perspectives and especially hearing voices of people that have been silenced throughout history or just haven't gotten the same opportunities to reach as many people. So does that kind of influence when you're writing these multiple voice poems?
It does on some level. Um, I don't think I'm always conscious of that. And um, some of the poems are not specifically social justice oriented. There is one of the poems in Holding My Selves Together, Double Down and Out in Milwaukee, that was written with that in mind. To get the doubleness, I needed another voice. And what and the voices alternate all through the poem. And the first voice, what the first voice begins with, the second voice ends with. So it's the same lines for both parts, but the reverse order. That's just seemed to me to be a way to do in language the idea that was in my head, that some things keep repeating and we're not breaking through to a solution. And so the arrangement may be different, but there's this echo and this repetitiveness that we need to work our way out of, that we need to find solutions to. So that was a poem that was pretty explicit with that idea.
I mean, you've clearly put so much thought and work into these poems, so I'm so excited that people will soon be able to read them all in one collection. So, something that I'm really interested about, you talked a lot about the performative aspects of poetry, and I think earlier you were right when you say like people often think of poetry as this very like solitary work. I've talked about that a lot in this podcast, just bookmaking in general. People think it's very isolated, but it's so communal, even in the earliest writing stages, as you've shared. So something that I'm curious about is how would you recommend reading these poems when you have them in print, especially if they are dual voice? There's one that I looked at was at James Chaney's grave 50 years later, where it's the three columns with the one voice, both voices, and the second voice. And visually, that's I don't wanna say it's overwhelming because that sounds unfair, but it's very interesting, and it made me pause and think, "Is this something that I can read, or is this something that really should be listened to?"
I think that there's lots of ways to experience that poem. Um, Actually, when I first wrote it, it was all one voice. It came out of an experience I helped to organize and then chaperone sort of. There was a school that studied the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer with there actually was 6 schools in Milwaukee that worked on this project. And then when the semester was over, the students had the option of going on this trip uh, to Mississippi and then a civil rights tour of the South and going to the 50th anniversary celebration of Freedom Summer in Jackson, Mississippi. One of the things that we did on that trip was to visit James Chaney's grave near Meridian, Mississippi, someone who had been a participant in Milwaukee's open housing marches, moved to Mississippi, and she was going to host us at that stop. And James Chaney was one of 3 civil rights workers killed in Mississippi in 1964, June 1964. There was a movie made about the incident called Mississippi Burning. The person who was hosting us, Pam Sargent, her name is, her cousin was visiting her cousin Helen, and the poem begins with Helen singing "My Life Is Not My Own." And that actually happened when we were at the grave site. She was there and she was singing that song, and she was keeping beat by tapping the back of one hand into the palm of the other hand. And it was so moving that I knew right away that that was the opening line of a poem. And I wrote the poem originally for one voice. I don't know, I don't remember how I just decided to start dividing it, but I did. And and I've read it several ways, and it depends upon the person that I'm reading with. Most of the second readers that I've worked with have wanted to alternate voices, except for those lines that are in the middle that we would read together. There were a couple of people who said, let's read these simultaneously. And when we did that, usually somebody in the audience would say, that was really amazing. I got a lot out of it, but would you now read it with the voices alternating so that I can hear it again and hear it differently? And so we've done that several times. So yes, you can read it by yourself. Just go across the page rather than down in columns, or you can find somebody who will read it with you, or you can do your own voice two different ways, one on the left side of the page, one on the right side of the page, or you can find somebody who's willing to read it simultaneously with you. It is amazing. What is amazing about that to me is, and again, I speak as a person who's not a good listener. When you're getting two voices at the same time, you really have to listen hard. And you might end up hearing more than you would if you were sort of half tuned in. Speaking as a person who's sometimes half tuned in. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I love that idea. And I love how you talked about how that poem can be so many different things. And I think the same could be said for many other poems in your book and just poems in general. Going back to that idea of like combining things, the obviously reading things at the same time is about as combined as you can get, but just instead of it just being, "This is how the poem has to be read, this is how it has to be done," there's many ways, and I love that. That's so cool.
Yeah, there are people who say that what's written on the page is not quite the poem. The poem is what happens when the reader encounters the poem. It's kind of an abstract idea. I think there's something to it though, that and if you have been a theater person, you know that the text is a starting point, not a finished point. And it's hard to relinquish that control over what you have written, um, but it's going to happen. And so I just want to be ready to enjoy that when it does happen.
Let's, now dive into your book, which we've already been done, but, in general, the book, Putting Myself Together, it's divided into 4 sections. Is that still correct? I have an earlier copy of it on my computer.
Yes, it
Okay.
is.
So what was the decision to make those 4 sections, and what material did you put in each section?
The first section is a section of Alice in Wonderland themed poems. Um, and those are the poems that I first approached Cornerstone Press with, asking if there was any interest in publishing these. And Professor Tangadal said, well, we really don't, that would kind of be chapbook length, and we don't really do chapbooks. Have you thought about doing a new and selected poems? Uh, and that bowled me over. I mean, that's like a real milestone for a poet. Um, and so I jumped at the possibility. And then what poems to select? Well, the second section are mostly poems from my first book, 200 Nights and One Day, which are poems about the Milwaukee's fair housing marches, in which I was a participant. There are some poems that were written later. So they're all civil rights poems, and most of them are about Milwaukee's open housing marches. The third section are social justice and gardening poems for the most part. A lot of them come from my book, Justice, Freedom, Herbs. But I do garden, and so I write gardening poems. I continue to write gardening poems, and so there are some poems that were written after that book included in that section. Some were published in journals. Some I just wanted to see. The fourth section came later. Many of them are poems that were written in the past year or year and a half. A lot of them are written thinking about how things changed with the pandemic. And that's where the title of the book comes from, because I felt for most of the past year that I was trying very hard to hold myself together. And there is that phrase in I think it's the first poem in that section. Um, it's not the title of that poem. It's just a phrase early in the poem that I suggested as being the title for the section and maybe for the book, and everybody said yes, yes, yes. One of the things that happens in the book is that the last poem in each section has the same title as the title of the next section. So when this last section was added, there was no poem in the previous section that had that title. So the editors said, can you write one? Can you fill in that gap? It's a gap. And it seems odd to come to the end of the book and the pattern isn't continued. So I said, well, maybe we could change one of the other titles and make it work. And they said, well, yes, maybe we could, but why don't you try writing a new poem? So I did. And so there is a poem called Holding My Selves Together, the same title as the book and the same title as the fourth section. And it would not be except for the wonderful editors of Cornerstone Press.
I'm sure they'll love to hear that. It won't go to their heads at all. That's fascinating. So I think you said that everyone was like, yes, that should be the title when you said Holding My Selves Together. And I completely agree. The plural of selves, I think, is so unique and eye catching. Can you talk about the multiple selves that you're referring to in that poem and in that title?
For a long time, I've had a sense of sort of two selves, at least. There's who I am as a poet, and there's who I am as social justice advocate. Actually, at least three, because I was a professor of English for 28 years. So there's that self. While those things work more or less smoothly for me most of the time, there were people who knew me as a poet and who didn't know about my social justice background, or there were people who knew me as an activist and then were surprised to find out when I was appointed poet laureate, oh, where did this come from? Yeah, well, I've been writing poems for a long time, but they didn't know that part of me. So there were those, so I've had that sort of sense for some time. There is a poem in, I think it's called Conjugating First Person, and it may be the first poem in that fourth section, where speaker is sometimes I, and sometimes you, and sometimes we, and sometimes they, and so it's the gardener and the activist and the grandparent and the poet and the person, conjugating pronouns, it's called. And part of what prompted that poem is not only this sense of playing different roles at different times and sometimes having to struggle to bring them into coherence. It also came from my fascination. I'm kind of a grammar geek. We probably all learned these definitions of first person, second person, and third person uh, somewhere early in our educations. It struck me particularly with second person, the person spoken to. So I'm speaking to you right now, Claire, and to the audience eventually, so you are you. But what I hear in conversation a lot, and I do it in conversation, find myself talking about myself using you. With a friend of mine, Kimberly Blazer, who is a past poet laureate, has a poem called The Poems You Didn't Write in Alaska. She's not talking to somebody else. She's talking about herself. She had this fellowship in Alaska, and there were poems that she wrote and there were poems that she didn't write And she wrote a poem about the poems she didn't write. The poems you didn't write in Alaska, really the poems I didn't write in Alaska. And it seems to me that people switch into second person when they're really talking about themselves, when they are generalizing, that they see their experience as being shared by other people. And so they say, well, you walk your dog and it gets dark and you get scared. And so you hurry home. I mean, I walked my dog and it got dark and I got scared. And so I hurried home. But so there's this slippage into second person. And that's where my fascination with pronouns began. It is also, I also found myself fascinated with first person plural. If you read a lot of critical essays about literature, which I did all through graduate school and beyond, I think people don't do it so much anymore because we've learned, whoever we are. But it used to be quite common that writers would talk about we or the reader having such and such an experience when it was the writer's experience, which may or may not be shared by other people. So I began to question we, sometimes questioning myself when who did I mean when I said we? Uh, and sometimes in a nice way, sometimes in kind of a smart alecky sort of way. Who do you mean by we? So I am this grammar geek, and I like to play with pronouns, and I'm influenced in this by Noam Chomsky, who described grammar as a description of a language system. So it's descriptive, not prescriptive. So what are people really doing with the language? And I want to hear what people are really doing with the language. And they're doing interesting things with pronouns. And so I play with it. And I think poetry is play.
So do you think that using we and you as a way to refer to the self is a way of kind of bringing the reader into those personal experiences because it does kind of like connect them in a way that maybe they wouldn't if it was just I?
I think you often does that. Well, in Kim Blazer's poem, the poems you didn't write in Alaska, I think that's part of what is going on. At least I think so. And I think that's what's going on in conversation when people slip into you. It's either a statement about the identification of the speaker and the spoken to, or it's a question, are we on the same wavelength here? At which point the you can say, no, I don't think so, or, yeah, nod your head, and yes, you are. Now you got me thinking about this. Now I want to go back through the poems and see how often that seems to be the case.
So when you're writing poems are how often would you say like the choices that you make are really conscious in terms of I want the poem to achieve this effect, so I'm going to do this in order to get that? And how often is it just kind of unconscious and you're just writing and then a moment like that happens where someone's like, "Oh, well, what about this?" And you're like, "Oh, I haven't thought about that." Is that something that you find a lot in your poems?
Most of the time, I don't know where the poem is going when I begin it. So in that drafting stage, in that first getting words on paper sort of stage, I'm in the process of discovering what it is I have to say, and where this poem is going to go. So it's more in subsequent drafts and revision that I make conscious choices about this gets me. Okay, the poem went here, and this is where I ended up. And if I want to be consistent with that, if I want to build toward that all along, I can't have this here, so I have to delete something. Or if I choose this word rather than that word, that fits better. Yeah, so those conscious choices, I think, come more in subsequent drafts. Every once in a while, you get a total gift. I get a total gift that a poem emerges in pretty much its finished form right away. And then I would say that all of those choices have been on a less than fully conscious level. They probably were brewing there on some level that I wasn't aware of. And then when they had a chance to get out, they did. Yeah. And then I don't want to mess with it. And I've already told students who have had the experience of writing a poem that is pretty much finished right away. Why don't I just get out of your way? You got it. You can tinker with it if you want, but yeah.
So how do poems like that work when you then like get into the editing stage? Like when the Cornerstone Press editors come in, is it more difficult to make changes to those poems if they're suggested by the editors?
Yes, it is. And I don't think we had many occasions like that. There were some questions about uh, what, why this line, or um, that was usually, or what does this mean? I think there was one time when somebody said, "What does this mean?" And I said, "I don't know," but it seemed to me to be an essential piece of the finished product. And then when we explored that a while, uh, came to some understanding about how it fit or how it could be made to fit better. But yeah, those generated probably the most back and forth discussion.
So working with the editors, you are probably one of the most experienced authors that we've had the privilege of publishing, and I know some of our editors were a little like nervous. We talked about it on the previous episode of this podcast where it's like, well, how do we give feedback to a poet laureate of Wisconsin? That's so amazing. And so what is it like working with students and with people who don't have your 30 plus years of writing experience?
It was wonderful. The times when you can get detailed feedback on a poem are pretty rare. I do belong to a critique group, and I've been in the same critique group. There are currently 7 of us. 3 of the 7 have been working together for, I don't know, 20 years or so. And from that group of readers, very detailed feedback is what happens. But when you've been working together that long and you know each other that well, you fill in gaps that people coming to your work for the first time don't have. They don't have that background knowledge about you and why you might say such a thing. And um, so it's a gift to have somebody willing to invest that time in talking with you about it. Even people who really like your work, like my work, now I'm really scared of using second person. People who will compliment me will say things like, "I really love that," or will repeat a line, and it's great to have that validation, but it's not the same thing as the more intricate, more um, talking about what's there. And so it was a wonderful experience, and the editors were thoughtful and insightful. I learned things about my poems that I didn't know from working with them, and it was so wonderful.
Oh,
I
I'm
really
so
enjoyed,
glad. And
enjoyed every minute of it.
I hope they're all listening to this because they need to hear that. It's so wonderful when authors get to have like really good experiences with us, and I don't we've never had a bad experience with an author, and I hope the opposite is true. I believe it is. Um, but yeah, that attention to detail is something that I know our editors are really proud of being able to provide, and the fact that we take on a relatively small amount of works each year, so we really get to focus and dig into all of those. I say we, even though I've never been an editor for the press. I've only ever worked in the marketing areas of it, so I'm also, I guess, now overthinking my pronoun usage.
We have ruined this conversation by talking so much about pronouns.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely not. It's a fascinating subject, and I think it's one of the cool things that poems can do is make us question things that we take for granted, even if it's something as simple as pronouns.
but we're self-conscious now in a way that we weren't when we began. Yeah,
Nah, I
yeah.
suppose that's just a possible
But
side effect.
about being edited and about talking with the editors, there's this too, that every poem is a new beginning. And yes, you do learn some things. For example, uh, learning things like not every line has to be end stopped, or you can come back at the end of a poem to an image that you used at the beginning of the poem. There are some things that you learn, but every every new poem is a new challenge, especially if you've gone a while before writing, since writing the last poem, before writing a new poem. I sometimes think, am I sure I know how to write a poem? Do I know how to write a poem as I get going? Yeah, 30 years of writing poems, I wouldn't want to do without it. Uh, it has been a tremendous help, but there is still something about this poem makes its own demands, and and so you have to think fresh.
Speaking of those individual challenges that a poem can bring, one of the poems that I'm particularly interested in is Ars Poetica, which you mentioned to me that it's meant to be sung. So, how do you go about writing a poem that is meant to be sung when people are then going to be like reading it?
Well, the whole poem is not meant to be there are two lines in each section that are lines from a song, um, and and they sound much better sung. And when I read it silently to myself, I hear those lines sung. Hesitate to sing in public. So I created a difficult situation for myself with that poem, because if I want to share it in public, that means I probably have to sing, unless I know somebody's going to be in the audience who's a really good singer and will sing it for me. And I have not yet been in that situation. Because we come from a experience of poetry where poets have been individual voices and often isolated. The artist in this, the starving artist in the lonely garret sort of image. We might think that multiple voices is, but I think it comes from a long tradition. That song, it was a freedom song. I learned it when I worked on a voter registration project in rural Alabama in 1965. Before it became a freedom song, before it was used in the civil rights movement, it was a spiritual. Um, and the first two lines, Paul and Silas were bound in jail. They had no money for to go their bail. There they are in this situation that isolates them from the community. So those lines seem to me to be um, appropriate for the part where I'm talking about the solo poet, the solitary poet, the poet all alone. And then Paul and Silas, in the second section, Paul and Silas began to shout, the jail doors opened and they walked out. So that liberation, that freedom comes from raising your voice, from singing, from being um, part of the community, and then you rejoin the community. You get out of this jail of self. I mean, it's literal in the Bible story. Paul and Silas were in jail. I'm making it metaphorical. That isolation is a kind of closed box, kind of. I don't want to minimize the suffering that people who are really incarcerated. So anyway, it was a way of showing there's a tradition of lifting your voice, of being heard, and then of that putting you back in touch with the community from which you came. And so that's what the song does there, I think, I hope. Um, yeah, I don't know. And I know a lot of readers will not have the experience of having that knowledge of that as a song, knowledge of those lines as a song. Um, and and actually, what happened when we were first looking at the manuscript, when I was first looking at the manuscript with the editors, was in copying the poems from one program to another, the italics got lost. So they didn't know that that I was quoting something and that was a song. The Paul and Silas were bound in jail. They had no money for to go their bail. That seemed like unusual syntax. So the question came up about that. And I said, well, I can't change that because that's a song, that's a direct quote. And then we realized that I had intended it to be italics, but it wasn't showing up as italics. That was one problem that was relatively easily solved. Not that any were real thorny, but yeah.
I really like the idea of taking work that exists like outside of your own and then bringing it in and making your own. It goes back to that idea of connectedness and combination that seems to run through a lot of your poetry, which I think is really beautiful. And as you just explained, so well thought out and thorough. So I really can't wait for people to read this book and get to experience all of that for themselves. So I think we are actually close to running out of time, but is there anything that you would like to share about your book, about your experience with writing, anything in general? The floor is completely yours.
I was at a lecture recently where the presenter said that what a poem is about is um, articulated after the fact. My talking about these poems, as we have been talking about them today, came from after they were written rather than from before they were written. And part of my ability to talk about them in the kind of detail that I am came from having to talk about them in the process of editing the book. Um, so why did you do this? Why this word? Why? Um, what would happen if we changed something? All those questions uh, prompted thinking about what was on the page in a way that I didn't think about it when it was in the process of getting on the page. So I'm really grateful to have had this experience. It's been a wonderful experience. I think these poems could not have been in better hands. Um, Thank you very much, one and all.
On behalf of everyone at Cornerstone Press, you're so welcome. And we would also really like to thank you. I know that everyone has had nothing but wonderful things to say about you and your work, and that everyone thinks it's really a privilege to get to work with you. And it's been truly a privilege to get to talk with you today about all of your work and to get your insight on it, which is something that I think really makes me revisit the work of Cornerstone authors in a different way after speaking with them, and hopefully other people will get the same experience when listening. I want to thank Margaret Rozga again for that amazing interview. And now you get to hear the poem that we were talking about during the episode, Amplifying Hope. So,
Amplifying hope. I hope no one gets hurt. I hope the earth survives.
I hope we all survive.
I hope there's space for Izzy to become an artist.
For Leia to make music on her small violin.
I hope
I hope.
to open my refrigerator to yellow, orange, and green peppers, to kale, beets, carrots, turnips, tortillas, eggs, butter.
Even meat.
I hope words don't fail me.
I hope I don't fail words.
Don't forget what goals I set.
Don't forget to set grand goals.
And don't forget the little ones, the fun of playing in snow despite the cold.
Of cold water from a summer's sprinkler.
Listening to the grown-ups when they think they're unheard or the message missed.
Don't forget to tell the little ones what our little hopes were, how we healed.
How odd we were at autumn's ginger moon low on the horizon. How we learned the earth turns. How in all the gnarled world people already hurt.
Already hungry, already rendered
Already rendered
speechless.
scant hope this world. May that scant hope not be dismantled.
May the dismantlers not make things worse.
What if we are our hope?
We hold our hope in our clasped hands, in our broken open hearts.
I hope,
I hope.
we
We
hope
hope
the
the
earth
earth
survives.
survives. Thank you so much to everyone listening to this episode. It has really been fun doing the podcast this semester, and this will be the last episode for this semester. I'm hoping to put out at least one episode during the summer, but if not, I will see you in the fall. And as a reminder, everyone can go onto our website to purchase our books. And that website again is uwsp.edu/english/cornerstone/pages/books.aspx. And on there, you can purchase all of our books, including Margaret Rozga's Holding My Selves Together, new and selected poems. Thank you, everyone, again for listening, and I'll see you all later.